Thank you very much, Christine, for that generous introduction, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a kind of an honour to collaborate with colleagues, especially in the British Council and elsewhere in Europe, and especially on this timely and important topic. And so I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A following the discussion. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. So I've got a few slides. Let's see if this goes. So my topic is on global migration and cities, and it's subtitled Cities of Fears and Cities of Hopes. And I guess what I want to do is explore how cities have something of a unique role in the incorporation of displaced migrants and refugees. But I also want to caution against a kind of a methodological localism, which is that we kind of focus on the local in a way in which prevents us from seeing beyond that, seeing the kind of multi-scalar. Something that I'll try and elaborate through an account of the governance of housing across a number of medium and large cities that we've been working on. Each of the cities that I'll talk about has developed something of a reputation for leaning against quite exclusionary state policy or state practice. But I guess one of the things I'm going to be arguing today and trying to show is that we might be prevented from seeing how cities can sometimes reproduce that exclusion if we only focus on the cities or on the local. Now, of course, the broader topic is set against the continuing and preventable tragedies caused by asylum and refugee approaches in a number of countries across Europe. And of course, the crisis often highlights the problems of the ways in which government and governing approaches at the national level are sometimes inadequate. And, the harrowing circumstances, of course, of the creation and the conditions and the destruction of the Moira camp in Greece is perhaps presently matched only by the danger of a number of national level governments potentially breaching the principle of non-refoulement, which is, the cornerstone of international refugee protection, which is that you don't return people to the point of origin who are, fleeing for reasons of persecution or perceived threat. We've seen in a number of countries following the COVID crisis that there is, I'm going to minimize this so you can see the whole screen, that there has been a degree of rhetoric, I think, amongst European leaders, which to some extent kind of articulates this anti-migrant sentiment. We see the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, tell the people of Hungary that their experience is that primarily foreigners have brought the COVID disease and that it's spreading principally amongst foreigners. In Italy, of course, you would have heard Matteo Salvini initially claim that it was a migrant refugee ship that brought COVID to Italy. In a similar vein, in other cases, in Sicily, there's been the promotion of fears around COVID and the closure of emergency reception centres. And a similar feature is true in places like Greece with New Democracy, and in France, Marine Le Pen, of course, has argued that the arrival of refugees has brought COVID with them. And now, as we've tried to trace in our research at the University of Edinburgh, and this is publicly available and you can download this, at least 57 countries are currently making no exception for refugees in their travel restrictions, even though the World Health Organization has offered some very clear guidance on the use of quarantines in health screening measures at points of entry for those fleeing persecution. So as a result, we've got a number of travel bans and other emergency measures at the moment, which has led to kind of rapid, to some extent, complete decline of the incorporation of displaced migrants and refugees at the borders, at the points of potential entry. And it's something which has left displaced migrants and refugees in incredibly precarious conditions. And people like Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, has argued that the core principles of international refugee protection are currently being put to test. And I would argue that that's true. I think that this is perhaps the most profound moment in thinking about refugee incorporation since the Second World War. I mean, it's that significant. So one question this begs is, then how might things be different, even in these difficult circumstances. And I think this is specifically a question for cities as they make sense and come to terms with the kind of the stop-start new normal that's been created by the pandemic. And specifically if they're going to overcome the double challenge of what I think is kind of a national level anti-migration hostility, as well as the material and technical implications of responding to COVID. Now, we can't answer these fully. We'll have to wait and see. But there's no doubt in my mind that whatever their answer is, it will rely upon what cities can do and how they can be mobilised in their response. And on that, I'd like to share some thoughts and begin, if I might, with the story of D'Amico Lucano. And note that it must be a very strange predicament to be banished from the city of which you were once the mayor. Now, so is the status of Lucano, once teacher and then mayor of Riace in the south of Italy. Mimmo, as he was known to Riacians, met the full force of the anti-immigrant politics of Matteo Salvini and then the La Lega party, which was at that point in coalition with Matteo Salvini, of course, serving as the interior minister. The underlying reason was that the town of which Mimmo was mayor led pioneering schemes from the 2000s to incorporate displaced migrants and refugees. His mayoralty founded an association, the City of the Future, which was based upon the Calabrian kind of utopianist Tommaso Campanella. And with a small amount of money, a small amount of funding, they managed to create very successful approaches to incorporating displaced migrants and refugees into local labour markets, but in ways in which not only regenerated formerly abandoned parts of Riace, but also the very kind of sociality, the very society of Riace itself. And in so doing, kind of staked a claim for reimagining the space in a way in which didn't kind of push migrants and refugees to the periphery, precisely as what thinkers about the city have characterized as having both kind of a claim to city life as well as having a very concrete claim to spaces of work, spaces of leisure, spaces of education, healthcare accommodation, which should be shared by all kind of urban dwellers. Now, I don't want to romanticize this example or brush over its many, many flaws, because there were many, but the point is that even though people didn't have necessarily a formal legal status, they nonetheless had a right to the city, which in a way is a kind of an older and important way of thinking about rights, which I think to some extent we have to rediscover in modern complex contexts. And in this case, and notably in addition to kind of pushing against perhaps national level policy and politics, the Riace model in Italy was also set against kind of organised crime, set against the Calabrian mafia, who continued to exploit migrants and refugees in agricultural labour in particular, where 12-hour shifts picking fruit in 40-degree heat is part of normal life, and with the coercion and violence is an example, I think, of modern day slavery, which is only just a couple of hours flight from where I'm speaking to you today. So the Riace model, as it became known, was kind of exported, and as I'll discuss, it arrived in other nearby towns and cities in the south of Italy. But the reason I begin with this story is that it's related to, I think, other examples of city and local level governance that's operated within some very difficult national level contexts where there's, at least intransigence and often kind of national level closure towards displaced migrants and refugees. If you think perhaps about the international cities of refuge network, the cities of sanctuary, the Save Me campaign, the Eurocities network, they're all kind of illustrative of what I'm trying to describe. And in each, we can kind of observe this recrafting of pre-existing ways of thinking about the city in ways that elevates the capacity of cities to foster what we might call new forms of solidarity. And yet, as I said at the beginning, in our enthusiasm to talk about this, I think we can overlook how cities are also kind of caught in this global and national kind of web that can perhaps inhibit them and inhibit the capacity of cities to provide that kind of solution. And I think what I'm kind of talking about pushes against what's sometimes called kind of the local turn or methodological localism that can downplay how cities are kind of interdependent, and how boundaries of cities can be forged. But I don't want to say that there hasn't been something very distinctive underway, seen in the role of a city in general. Amongst responses to the so-called refugee crisis, where I think civic society especially has been incredibly effective at engendering forms of first response and incorporation, I suppose, broadly conceived, including the kind of ways in which migrants and refugees themselves have been at the forefront of that. And in that context, whatever the national framework of immigrant incorporation policy and approach and rhetoric and everything else might be, the urban level really needs to be appreciated as a policy-making field, I think, in and of itself. I think that's very much true in what we sometimes call emergency governance, the kind of the first arrival and response type of approach. The question is how embedded that kind of stuff will be. And I think that to some extent also relies upon the character of each city, its own history, its distinctive trajectory. So there's a number of features of this that I want to kind of run through in this talk this morning. To get to that, I'm going to spend a moment thinking about how we can imagine the relationship between cities and migration historically. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our project, which is ongoing, which Christine mentioned at the start, Glimmer, which focuses on a number of cities in the south and the north of Europe. And it includes the key question, I suppose, of housing in Cosenza in Italy, in Glasgow in Scotland, and Malmö in Sweden. Now, these are what are sometimes called kind of low-scale cities, because they assume a relatively weak position within global exchanges, or they were dependent on particular industries or sectors, but they matter. And one of the reasons we say they matter is that they're characteristic of European cities. Most European cities aren't the global cities. Most European cities are of this kind of type. Before, I'm going to just offer some final observations that we can wrap up with. So how can we think about the relationship between cities and migration? Well, look, this is a huge task, and I can't really do it justice. But because I'm a sociologist, I thought about the work of this writer called Zygmunt Bauman, and he has this kind of working paper that he didn't really flesh out properly, and he passed away. And I suppose it's kind of a cliche to say that cities are places where strangers meet, and yet in this, for Bauman, are the fears of change, but also the capacity of how cities can also be places of hope. So both, he argued, are related to the same impulse and reflect how the city and social change are almost synonymous. Change is the quality of city life and a mode of urban existence. Change in the city may and indeed should be defined by reference to each other. Now, I think it's true of a great deal of Zygmunt Bauman's work, especially his latter work. He was kind of reflecting on quite a long-standing literature on thinking about cities as something which spans disciplines, methodology, scales of the micro, the meso, the macro, questions of agency, of social structure, of issues of capital, and issues of community. And any kind of historical approach to this sometimes draws upon European thinkers like Max Weber, who talked about what we might call city-generating factors, and by which he kind of meant the ways in which cities have this particular requirement. They need this combination of kind of economic enterprise, kind of a particular administrative structure. They need a certain kind of civic life to them. And he kind of offers this typology, and I won't go into it because it's a bit academic-y, but, he talks about how the cities have to span markets, social relations, bureaucracies. And with some kind of clumsy discomfort, when I think about how we've understood the city over the last 30 years, I think that kind of typology still matters. And in it, we might include people like Saskia Sassen, who wrote this book in the early 90s, And I think it's probably been amongst the most influential ways of thinking about the city. And because she argued that global cities, can be studied as financial market centers, as sites where the command structure of global capital are kind of geographically decentralized, but not devolved to the city. Now, this is something which has been taken up by people like Doreen Massey, who tells this story about London, and she talks about how deregulation, financialization, and commercialization of all aspects of city life, is a way of kind of telling a story of an increasingly unequal world. I think all this stuff is very compelling, but I think what it misses is how human bodies, and often the labor and the human bodies of migrants, are also kind of a commodity which is bought, trafficked, and stored by multi-scalar agencies within cities, including in places like detention centres, where transnational corporations are able to accumulate through what we might call dispossession. And the reason I say that is that they too are characteristic of contemporary cities. And characteristic of the development of urban space, which can sometimes include this kind of double displacement, not only of migrants and refugees, but also of marginalized populations who live within those cities, who are kind of pushed out for people who have more consumer potential, sometimes understood as gentrification, but that's not the only way to think about gentrification. And I think it's in this mode that we need to include some of the more Panglossian or optimistic accounts of the capacity of cities, and that's presented in places like Ben Barber's really quite influential story of how cities are emerging where states are failing. I think this has been quite an unfortunate reading of the administrative and the legal capacity of cities that I kind of want to push against, specifically by highlighting how refugee services and infrastructure are often taken not by cities, but by multinational businesses. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. One of the other things that Max Weber in his typology talked about was social dwellings. And we've thought a little bit about this in recent contributions of scholars who've tried to understand the migrant city. And I've just put up this slide here from Susan Hall, who showed famously in this study that you could track this one road in London and show its kind of transnational character to various points within the formerly British Empire. So this one street in London can effectively be mapped to the globe. And one of the things that illustrates then is that migration too is a city generating factor. You can't really have cities without migration. And I suppose we need to just recognize that. But how and in what ways that works varies. The historical growth and expansion of cities, as well as their role and their function in the process of the development of cities, is conditioned by different kinds of things. And at the same time, the migration and migrants themselves, we know, continually kind of reshape the city in the urban space and continue to contribute to wider processes of change that Zygmunt Bauman at the beginning thought was a point of hope. Yet all of this is subject to the particular character of cities, as I said before. And, this might be understood in what people have called cognitive, cultural, urban landscapes, which is a mouthful and which I understand to mean how specific cities have types of opportunity structures because they lend themselves to certain kinds of migrant entrepreneurship. From a different perspective, you might think of our cities have a relationship to generate forms of solidarity in terms of what's sometimes called welfare cities, and that's about the relationship between different workers in low income and casual labour. I kind of want to pivot on this point really as I move on, just to say that in addition to the city being a means of grasping at migration, and vice versa, what I don't think was sufficiently understood is the role of governance in all of this, and especially the governance of displaced migrants and refugees. And I think this deserves attention because this is where I think Bowen's kind of allegory of cities of hope and cities of fears is most stark, something that traverses, the everyday encounter in city life, but also, supposedly higher level concerns. Because one of the things that I want to argue, and one of the things that I state routinely, is that it's not just in the kind of everyday mix that we encounter in cities, but it's in the kind of the policy governance that the boundaries of a city is forged. And this includes how cities seek to sometimes deter migration in addition to facilitate and support its entry, let alone the various kind of processes for integration. And I think that's especially reflected in how we think about housing and accommodation for displaced migrants and refugees. Now, at present, I think there's been a number of ways of kind of thinking about this that I want to pick up on. But what I'm going to talk about is some of our research, which, as I indicated at the beginning, has tried to span the south and the north of Europe, which kind of adds to ways in which we can think about cities, which doesn't reject what countries are doing at national level, but it adds a degree of detail and nuance. It's not understanding housing at the city level against what the national government in any respective country is doing, but it's trying to make sense of what that national level country is doing. And in our cases, we've picked a number of areas which are broadly comparable in terms of their size, but their experiences with migrants and refugees has differed considerably. So, as you see the slide at the top left, you see a picture of Glasgow, which has accommodated displaced migrants and refugees from the middle of the 20th century. But, that was mainly established through what we might call managed resettlement programs, which brought relatively small groups of people to Scotland, to Glasgow. And that changed significantly in the early noughties, when the UK adopted what was called a dispersal scheme, which was effectively meant to share the arrival of those people seeking asylum from the southeast of England, to around the UK. And Scotland's now the biggest place in the whole of the UK that receives dispersed asylum seekers and people seeking refugee status. Meanwhile, in Malmo, which is a picture of the housing block in the bottom right corner of this slide, it's obviously the third largest city in Glasgow. It's located on the border with Denmark, and it bears too a kind of a long-standing migration city, a long-standing status as a migration city. But the nature of that migration has changed. It's gone from being a kind of a labour migration, but as Malmo has declined as a kind of a industrial a site of industrial employment, the nature of that migration has shifted from being labour migration to increasingly asylum and displaced refugee arrival. In addition to those two cases in the global north, we have Cosenza, which is just this plaque to the top right, in the Calabria region that includes Riace, where I began this story. And it's become a place of almost uninterrupted arrival. In contrast, and reversing to some extent, outward migration historically, long periods of which went to the north, eastern Italian regions, or indeed went abroad. Now, in each of these cases, there's kind of longer and shorter term housing provision, and that kind of shows how cities try to traverse and negotiate or acquiesce with what's happening kind of at the national level. But what is short term and what is long term, of course, at the city level in terms of housing, isn't different from the wider migration experience of displaced migrants and refugees in terms of their status. And one of the reasons that we're focusing on housing so much in our project is that it's a key sector of integration, and certainly of meaningful integration. It's often, seen as a kind of a cornerstone. And this is a quote from Deborah Phillips, where she illustrates that as a scholar and a researcher of migrant housing. She talks about how housing conditions and the experience of refugees clearly play an important role in shaping their sense of security and belonging, having a bearing on their access to healthcare, education, employment, the ability to access safe, secure, and affordable housing It's also likely to have an impact on community relations, the level of secondary migration by refugees, and the development of migrant households' capacity for secure and independent living. Now, in all of our cases, we found, of course, that to be profoundly true. And in Cosenza, we found that there was a kind of what we might characterize as a two-stage approach to this. So I'm just going to talk a little specifically now, a little bit about the ways in which different cases have approached this challenge of offering accommodation to displaced migrants and refugees at the local level, at the city level, in a way in which can sometimes depart from what's going on at the national level. So in Cosenza, refugees were typically kind of housed firstly in what's called an extraordinary reception centre in the CAS centres, but then they were moved into what used to be called a SPARA network, which is effectively a network of projects that collaborated with the third sector, with charities, but also with local authorities and local mayoralties, as well as the private sector. And very much relied upon labour market participation as being, a key objective of long-term integration. And that's really the Riace model, right? That's what Italy learned from its experience with the mayoralty of Domino Lucano. So this is kind of built upon existing third sector networks that were prevalent in the 1990s and used a little bit of money from central government to draw together these different stakeholders, the third sector, the private sector, local authorities and governments. It was incredibly successful. And in many respects was a bit of an example that the rest of European approaches might be informed by. What the Cosenza model didn't do, and what it started to adopt under the period of the Interior Ministry of Matteo Salvini, was to make a distinction between people who had formal refugee status and people who were seeking asylum. And what's happened now is that because that distinction has become a key means of organising the reception of displaced migrants and refugees, those who are seeking asylum are increasingly caught in this first stage, in these kind of emergency reception centres, and they can't move then into the SPARA network, which is what they need to do to effectively lead a full integrated life in that city. So how can that kind of bottom-up approach be contrasted with what's going on elsewhere? Well, the case in Malmo was illustrative in a different way, because that kind of comes from much more of a top-down way, and it showed us the ways in which cities are still profoundly informed by the actions of central government. So in 2016, there was a settlement law which made it mandatory in Sweden for all municipalities to receive refugees and to kind of organise their housing. The numbers of refugees received by the county or the municipality was suggested by the Swedish Migration Agency, but the decision on the form of that kind of reception was often made by each local authority. And it reflected labour market opportunities, housing stock, past experience of incorporating displaced migrants and refugees. But the Malmo case brings back into view what I was calling the multi-scalar at the beginning, because it shows how city-level approaches, not only in housing, but in this case in housing, can't really be understood without appreciating the function of national level welfare regimes that's kind of embedded a certain kind of approach, and in this case a certain kind of welfare solidarity across which kind of local practice and approach moves. Now that relatively straightforward approach in Malmo, gets incredibly more complicated in Glasgow and in Scotland. Because here asylum seekers are often accommodated on what's sometimes called a no-choice basis. Now, as I said at the beginning, the accommodation provision in Scotland and in Glasgow, the city, is very much affected by national level dispersal. So people are brought to Glasgow from often the southeast. But here's the tricky part of this kind of governance dynamic and the complicated part of it. The city of Glasgow has little to no capacity to interfere in the housing and the accommodation of displaced migrants and refugees who do not have refugee status. And by interfere, I mean they often don't even provide the accommodation, because it's multinational housing providers like Serco and others who will have the housing provision. So the city of Glasgow, the government of Scotland have little to no influence in determining the housing allocation in their city of displaced migrants and refugees. That's run, a multi-level in a multi-level fashion from London and operated and provided by international providers. So you have in this city an inability to kind of provide care in many respects, which is another illustration of why I was so kind of critical of Ben Barber's argument at the beginning that cities are simply the solution to where states are struggling. So I'm just kind of bringing this to a close, really, and thinking about how we might think about this in terms of conversation and discussion. I think that the degree to which what I've been describing could be, characterised to some extent a rescaling of statehood or kind of a decoupling between local and national levels. There's a long-standing kind of literature which tries to say that. Scholars, colleagues like Myberg characterise it as local governments just, shifting from something of a passive role to a more active role. I think that's wrong. And I think that kind of ignores the historical role and status of cities. The cities never went away as states became more powerful. But it also misdescribes what we're witnessing, the governance dynamics at play. I think what's going on isn't about what we might call incommensurability. A city does one thing set against the state doing another thing. It's about the kind of meshed nature of those dynamics, about that relationship between the city and the state. I don't think cities and local authorities are simply the sites for kind of national level processes to filter down. They have a distinctive and we might say historical role to play in the design and the implementation of refugee and integration processes and programs. But I think those dynamics are easy to overstate. And I would challenge the argument that the city can simply address the limitations of the national. And indeed, in our findings, in our research, while there's kind of room for manoeuvre, it might be very limited, actually. And indeed, no less significant, when the state evacuates itself and it removes itself from kind of key provision, key commitments to care at the local level, the local doesn't just pick that up. In a number of our cases, actually, one of the prevailing features is displaced migrant and refugee destitution, homelessness, because the state won't take responsibility at the national level. And there isn't an infrastructure at the local level to pick that up. And so I suppose that we might just suggest then, and this is where I'll wrap up, is that in addition to there being a kind of a way of thinking about the city as being a means through which you can hope for and imagine a better future because of the kind of the contact that one has between other citizens and non-citizens, simply in the kind of the everyday milieu, the kind of the rub, the shared space, the commonality. I think in addition to that, we need to think much more about the governance of urban life, and specifically the policy governance of urban life, because I think it's in that we find the boundaries of cities are forged, no more than everyday attitudes and encounters. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that allows us enough time for conversation.